Sri Lanka is facing the worst economic collapse of its modern history.
The country's most chaotic day in months of political turmoil. Tens of thousands of people storming the presidential palace and prime minister's home. Protesters holding President Gotabaya Rajapaksa responsible for the nation's economic meltdown, setting off acute shortages of essential items like food, fuel, medicine, and other necessities.
Sri Lanka's parliament has voted six-time Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe as the new president. He's going to be replacing Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who resigned last week after months of protests in the country.
Motorists, tuk-tuk drivers and taxi drivers queue for fuel and jostle for fuel in this queue that I hear is stretching 4 to 5 kilometers. And this is the economic reality that the new president of Sri Lanka has to fix.
This is due to long-standing structural weaknesses exacerbated by a series of idiosyncratic shocks. Sri Lanka's crisis can be a warning sign to other developing nations because in many ways it's a classic emerging market crisis. The Rajapaksa family dominated Sri Lankan politics effectively from the mid-2000s, from 2005 onwards when Mahinda Rajapaksa came to power.
After the civil war in Sri Lanka ended in 2009, he had absolute control over every department and every ministry of the government of Sri Lanka. So he ruled as an absolute ruler without much of accountability. And he brought in his brothers, his nephews, and even his son played a very important role in governing Sri Lanka, both as ministers as well as power behind the throne. And people were really fed up with what they were seeing that the ruling family was doing.
Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in his campaign, he made a promise of tax cuts.
I think the tax cuts were designed to be populist, and maybe there was some idea that it would spur growth.
Sri Lanka has state-owned enterprises that are hugely loss-making. They have regulated industries, state control of a lot of arenas of the financial and economic sector. Just before the COVID shock hit, these tax policies were put Sri Lanka in a place where government revenues fell even further. It was getting harder and harder to service debt.
Today we want to talk about one of the most important aspects of this crisis, and that was imposing a ban on the import of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. In April 2021, a ban was imposed. Sri Lankan government suddenly decided and declared that nationwide, no chemical fertilizers and pesticides will be imported anymore. All the farmers will have to use organic pesticides and fertilizers.
I think the ban on chemical fertilizers was sold as a shift to organic fertilizers and being projected to as an environmental move. But I think the real reason for the ban on chemical fertilizers was to save on foreign exchange, because Sri Lanka was already having trouble meeting its debt service obligations.
It was an ad hoc policy change on the part of the Sri Lankan government, enacted almost overnight without any planning, without any expert input.
So from 2010 until 2019, Sri Lanka's tourism sector actually performed remarkably well.
It was growing very rapidly up until the Easter bombings in 2019. So that was an unexpected attack for Sri Lanka, because prior to that, Sri Lanka did not have any significant Islamic terrorist activity. And so this was an idiosyncratic event that had impacts, at least in the short and medium term, on the tourism sector.
But then the most critical thing was the COVID, which stopped all tourism everywhere in the world. So everyone was hit. And Sri Lanka was no exception. The problem with Sri Lanka was its dependence on tourism for foreign exchange earnings. This crisis was kind of precipitated by the fact that that earning just got wiped out overnight for not only a few months, but years. And Sri Lanka's tourism industry hasn't come back at all to the same levels as it was before 2019.
In terms of a path forward, or in the short and medium term, Sri Lanka needs to get its debt under control, or debt payments under control. The goal of the negotiations with the IMF is for that to happen. The Sri Lankan government is trying to negotiate an extended fund facility, or EFF. So the EFF is designed to assist countries in exactly the sort of crisis that Sri Lanka is in. The Sri Lankan government should have gone to the IMF sooner, but it was clearly not willing to pay the political cost, but now there's no other choice.
What is going to be needed is essentially an injection of funds, and Sri Lanka cannot meet its debt obligations, so some of the creditors are just going to have to share in the losses.
In terms of the role of China, so even though debt from China is not the biggest chunk of Sri Lankan debt, they're the largest bilateral lender. And in terms of what kind of concessions lenders are willing to give, China's decisions will matter a lot. So whether they are party to the negotiations or will have separate negotiations with separate conditions for the Sri Lankan government is yet to be seen.
Is Sri Lanka's economic collapse ringing alarm bells for emerging markets? I think the alarm bells for emerging markets has been ringing for quite a while. We have been ignoring those. Pakistan was another country which is very much in a very poor economic condition. Ongoing protests in Peru, I would say, against food and fuel price rises.
Many countries had similar problems in terms of losing sources of foreign exchange, having their public finances negatively affected.
So what's changing now is that we're coming out of this low interest rate environment. Interest rates are going to be higher going forward, and many of these emerging markets will have foreign currency denominated or dollar denominated debt. And the dollar is strengthening because of the current monetary policy regime in the US. So all of these, together with a few idiosyncratic shocks, could make another emerging market go into crisis. And the next one might not be a relatively small country like Sri Lanka.
The Sri Lankan crisis is a sign to other countries in the world, especially other developing countries with high levels of debt and political instability, that things can go really wrong really quickly. It is also a lesson for international donors and other organizations that they need to get their act together when they have to help countries in crisis. This is not going away anytime soon. We are just starting a very difficult phase of global economic downturn.